Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. On a quiet New Mexico morning, veteran rancher Morgan Trace finds a glossy envelope on his doorstep. Inside, a demand for thousands in HOA fees for a community he never joined. What follows is a high-stakes battle of fraud, forged documents, and one man's fight to protect his family's land. It was a Sunday morning, the kind I used to treasure. The kind where the only sound is the soft crunch of gravel under boots, the occasional bawl of a cow waiting to be fed, and wind rustling through fence wire like some old ghost humming to itself. My name's Morgan Trace, and for the past 22 years, I've lived and worked this land the way my grandfather taught me. 520 acres of sunburnt New Mexico earth, handed down through blood and bone since 1963. No mortgage, no partners, no strings, just me, my livestock, and the ground beneath my boots. That's why, when I came back in from feeding the cattle and found a letter shoved under the screen door, I didn't think twice about tossing it on the kitchen counter. It had that look of junk, thick, glossy envelope, official-looking emblem that screamed marketing rather than emergency. I poured myself a mug of coffee, sat at the table, and stared at it anyway. Something about the way it was addressed, resident of Lot 37, Hacienda Arroyo Estates, rubbed me wrong. My land isn't a damn lot, it's a legacy. I opened it with one of those petty kinds of curiosity, half expecting a property scam or developer pitch. Instead, it was a bill, a formal demand from the Hacienda Arroyo Estates Homeowners Association. $8,600 in unpaid dues, including a one-time initiation fee, 3 years of retroactive maintenance assessments, administrative penalties, and interest. Interest. For what? I didn't know whether to laugh or burn the thing. I've never signed a single document with this HOA. I'm not in any HOA. Hell, I'm not even in their zip code. Or so I thought. The whole thing read like a parody of bureaucracy. They even included a friendly pamphlet describing community standards and a helpful chart about grass height compliance. Grass. On a cattle farm. I called their listed number. A receptionist with the voice of someone who practiced saying policy in the mirror every morning picked up. I told her this must have been a mistake. She asked for my resident identification number. I said I didn't have one. She asked what unit I lived in. I said, the house my grandfather built by hand. She told me to direct all inquiries to the financial compliance officer, and then she hung up. I didn't know whether to punch a wall or call my lawyer. I chose neither. I figured it would all disappear like a bad dream. 3 weeks later, I got slapped awake. I came home from town with feed supplies, and there it was, an official envelope from the Sandoval County Clerk's office. I opened it, and my hands went cold. It was a court summons, not a request, not a notice, a full-blown lawsuit filed against me for failure to satisfy homeowner association obligations. They claimed a lien had been placed on my land. My land. The language was dense, but the message was clear. According to some bureaucratic gremlin in a windowless office, my property was being treated as collateral for a debt I didn't owe to an organization I didn't join. I drove straight to the county recorder's office. I know most of the staff by name, but that didn't make what I found any easier to stomach. One of the junior clerks pulled up the parcel map for my property. I nearly swallowed my tongue. There it was, in crisp digital lines. My land, now showing a gray overlay on the eastern boundary, labeled Community Expansion Zone, approved 2022. I asked them when this change was made. The clerk said it was processed during the HOA boundary adjustments phase. I asked him what the hell that even meant. He shrugged and said it had something to do with recreational space alignment and community infrastructure integration. None of it made a lick of sense. I asked who approved it. He said, and I quote, it was an automated compliance update based on county integration protocols. I had to stop myself from screaming. Then came the real gut punch. He pulled up a scanned copy of a form titled Voluntary Integration Agreement. It had my name printed neatly on the signature line, and a signature that looked, at first glance, just enough like mine to make my stomach twist. I leaned closer. The curl on the T in Trace was wrong. The angle of the M didn't match my hand. The date was 6 months ago, a time when I was recovering from a torn rotator cuff and couldn't hold a pen properly. I left that office in a fog. The sun outside was too bright, the wind too quiet. That piece of land out there, The same patch of earth my grandfather built his home on with hammers and sweat and fence wire and grit had been redrawn behind my back by people who saw land as square footage and integration potential. Someone had falsified my consent. And for the first time in a long, long time, I felt something inside me start to burn. Not just anger, not just insult. It was older than that. It was blood deep. I'd served in the Navy for 12 years. I'd been stationed overseas. I'd seen war zones and worse. But this was theft. Paper-bound, polite-faced, well-dressed theft. And they were coming for my land. The next morning, I was in my truck before dawn, rolling down Highway 14 toward Albuquerque with a thermos of black coffee and a folder full of land records in the passenger seat. My lawyer, Susan Lath, had agreed to meet me at her office on short notice. Susan wasn't just some strip mall attorney with a shiny sign and a website full of stock photos. She'd been my father's lawyer, and before that, my grandfather's. If there was anyone who understood property law in Sandoval County down to the bedrock, it was her. She listened as I laid it all out, every last detail from the bogus dues letter to the phantom signature. She didn't interrupt, just took notes with the kind of grim efficiency that only shows up when someone smells legal blood in the water. When I finally finished, she looked up and said flatly, "They forged your damn signature." I nodded. "Can we prove it?" I asked. "Easily," she said. "We'll get a forensic handwriting analyst to examine the document. You've got enough signed records to establish a comparison baseline." Then she narrowed her eyes. "But here's the real question. Why would an HOA try to incorporate a private farm they've got no legal access to?" We didn't have to wait long for an answer. Susan filed an emergency request with the county to obtain the original documents from the incorporation phase of Hacienda Arroyo Estates. Most of them were exactly what you'd expect: meeting minutes, maps, boilerplate community covenants. But tucked deep inside a supplemental filing dated 2 years ago was a scanned form labeled Regional Development Zone Adjustment Request. It was signed off by a mid-level clerk from the Land Use Office and stamped with an approval from the HOA. President Karen Martinez. Attached to the request was a map. My farm's eastern border had been shaded in pink and marked Recreational Buffer Zone. Buffer Zone. That was their language for it. Like my fields, my irrigation canals, and my cattle pens were just some decorative dam park. Susan leaned back in her chair, squinting at the screen. They filed this during a zoning amendment push tied to community development grants. You weren't just annexed, Morgan. You were folded in deliberately. And here's the kicker. They submitted a signed consent form to make it legal. I told her I never signed anything. She said she believed me. So, we got to work. Susan reached out to a forensic analyst she'd used in a couple estate fraud cases. We overnighted him the original voluntary integration agreement, along with over a dozen samples of my real handwriting. It took him 48 hours. His report was short and brutal. Signature is not consistent with subject's known handwriting. Key letter formations inconsistent. Probability of forgery high. That was our smoking gun. We now had legal grounds to challenge the incorporation and nullify the lien, at least temporarily, but Susan was already thinking 2 moves ahead. If they're forging consent forms, she said, then someone at the county level helped them slip it through. There's no way this made it into the official parcel system without a compliant clerk. She started digging. Public records requests. FOIA filings. She combed through staff changes at the Sandoval Land Office for the past 5 years. And then we found him. Derek Tully, Assistant Administrator, GIS Department, promoted 18 months ago. No public social media presence, but we found his name listed on 2 HOA newsletters from Hacienda Arroyo Estates. Guest speaker, community planning advisor. Not a stretch to assume he was the one who helped slide my farm into the HOA's digital map like a missing puzzle piece. No one questioned. Meanwhile, Karen Martinez wasn't hiding. She gave an interview to a local lifestyle magazine bragging about the exciting expansion of Hacienda Arroyo and the new green zones being incorporated. She called it a visionary project and said it would bring cohesion and modern community, values to historically fragmented zones. Fragmented. That's what she called my family's farm. Then came the phone call. Susan put it on speaker. It was Karen. She was smooth as butter and just as greasy. "Mr. Trace," she said, "I understand there's been some confusion about the recent integration process. I'd love to invite you to our next board meeting to clear things up and discuss your obligations as a new member of Hacienda Arroyo Estates. I didn't respond. Susan did. Ms. Martinez, my client, is not a member, was never a member, and has not signed any agreement to become one. There was a pause. Karen replied sweetly, "We have your consent on file. If you dispute that, I suggest you bring it up in arbitration." And then she hung up. Susan looked at me. "They're daring you to sue." I didn't even blink. "Then let's give them a reason to regret that." The next day, we filed a formal complaint in Sandoval County Superior Court accusing the HOA and any cooperating officials of fraudulent annexation, forgery, and malicious encumbrance of property. We attached the forensic report, property deed history, and copies of the zoning adjustment requests. Susan made sure every major local outlet got a copy of the filing. We weren't just going to beat them in court. We were going to drag their name through the mud they tried to pave over my land. 3 days later, I stepped outside just after sunrise and saw the first stake. It was bright orange, capped with a plastic flag that fluttered in the wind, hammered deep into the soil about 15 feet inside my eastern boundary. I stared at it for a moment, wondering if some drunk hiker had lost his way, until I noticed another stake further down the fence line, then another, and another. A neat little line, marching its way across my pasture like a declaration of war. I walked the perimeter, boots crunching against frost-bitten dirt, tracing the line of flags. They carved a perfect corridor across a quarter-mile of land, right through grazing space, irrigation lines, and one of my oldest oak groves. And at the very end of the row, a laminated sign zip-tied to a steel post. Future site, Hacienda Arroyo Estates Community Trail Network. Installation pending. I stood there in silence, eyes locked on that sign, feeling something ancient tighten behind my ribs. This wasn't just paperwork anymore. This was real. Steel posts, plastic flags, spray-painted X's on my fence. Somebody had crossed over from legal fiction into physical trespass, and they thought I was too stupid or slow to notice. An hour later, a pair of white pickup trucks rolled up to my gate. Out stepped a crew of 4 men in reflective vests, with clipboards, hard hats, and the smirks of people who had no idea whose land they just stepped onto. One of them, clearly the foreman, approached like he was about to ask for directions. "You must be Mr. Trace," he said, casual as can be. "We're here on behalf of the Hacienda Arroyo Homeowners Association, just marking out the trail infrastructure ahead of next quarter's construction. Shouldn't take more than a week or two, and we'll be out of your hair." I blinked. "You're standing on private land," I said, flat. "You need to get the hell off it." He frowned, held up a clipboard. "We've got authorization forms. This tract was annexed into the community expansion zone. We've got permits from the county and everything." I took the clipboard. It was printed in that sterile HOA language. Talk of recreational corridors, shared resource zones, and resident-approved community development. Nowhere on it was my name nor a signature. I handed it back without saying a word. He didn't take the hint. "Sir, we're not here to cause trouble. We're just doing our job. If you have a problem, I recommend you speak with the HOA board. We're on a schedule." That's when I walked back to the house, unlocked the gun cabinet, and returned with a Remington 870 slung across my shoulder. I didn't point it, didn't even raise my voice, just said, "This land is under private title. If you or your men drive one more post, I'll be filing for criminal trespass and notifying the sheriff. Now leave." They left, not in a panic, but with that look construction guys get when they know their boss has sent them into someone else's mess. An hour later, I was on the phone with Sheriff Pinter. Good man. I served with his brother back in the Navy. When he pulled up in his cruiser, he took one look at the markers and let out a long sigh. "Jesus, Morgan. They're serious, huh?" I handed him the laminated sign and told him everything. The forged signature, the lien, the stakes. Pinter looked over the documents the construction crew had left behind and whistled through his teeth. "Technically, they've got permits, but if those permits are based on fraudulent boundaries..." He shook his head. "I'll file an incident report and flag this with the DA. In the meantime, I'm issuing a stop work order on anything involving your property lines." That night, I slept with one eye open, and just as well, because the next morning, a letter appeared on my doorstep. No postage, no envelope. Just a single sheet of paper typed in neat black font. It read, "You are illegally occupying land designated for public community use. Cease your obstruction immediately. This is your final warning." No name, no signature, just an HOA seal in the header and a blood-red underline beneath the word final. Susan was furious when I showed her. She filed a formal complaint with the state land office and a restraining order request against any unauthorized development actions on my land. Meanwhile, I installed new security cameras, 4 high-resolution systems with license plate recognition and motion alerts that pinged my phone. I wasn't going to wait around for the next stunt. 2 nights later, the cameras caught it. A black SUV parked just off the road, its lights off. 2 figures jumped the fence and pulled up 3 of the warning signs I'd posted around my perimeter. One of them tried to hammer in a new stake before running off when the floodlights kicked in. I sent the footage to Susan and the sheriff. We both knew what was coming. The battle for my land had stopped being polite, and the HOA wasn't playing by the rules anymore, if they ever had. I found out about the auction from a neighbor who heard it mentioned at a local diner, the kind of overheard whisper that sounds too absurd to be true until it isn't. According to him, a tract of land out by Arroyo Ridge had been listed for upcoming tax lien foreclosure, tagged as part of a delinquent HOA zone. He hadn't said my name, but I felt it deep in my gut. I got in my truck and drove straight to the Sandoval County Assessor's office with my boots still caked in dry manure and fury simmering just below the surface. It took less than 5 minutes to confirm it. My property, my 520 acres, was listed under a pending foreclosure hearing scheduled for the following month. The official tag? HOA integrated parcel, liens unpaid, eligible for expedited transfer via community auction. It was listed right there, alongside tracks from abandoned warehouses, defunct gas stations, and one poor bastard's RV plot in the desert. I demanded an explanation. The clerk, some poor 20-something who looked like he hadn't fought anything fiercer than a printer jam, mumbled that the parcel classification had changed due to a community restructuring action, and that any formal objections had to be submitted through the Property Board of Appeals. I told him I'd submit something all right, but it wouldn't be polite. Back in Susan's office, we tore through every available record, and there it was. Buried in a supplemental file was a memo from the Office of Land Management, signed by a man named Gregory Madsen, Deputy Director for Zoning Oversight. A familiar name, Susan had flagged him before as being oddly involved in local HOA territory expansions. In this memo, Madsen had approved a fast-track reassignment for unincorporated properties absorbed via overlay zoning jurisdiction, citing community betterment and improved land utilization. It was bureaucratic nonsense dressed up in legalese, but it was enough for them to list my land for sale. The kicker, the approval had been pushed through during a county board meeting with no public notice, no agenda item, no recorded vote. It had been slipped in during a routine budget adjustment session and buried in a 500-page transcript. It wasn't just sloppy, it was deliberate. That's when Susan called in a favor. She knew a journalist in Santa Fe, Benji Mercado, a firebrand freelancer who made a career out of exposing small-town corruption and land grabs. Within 24 hours, he was sitting across from me on my porch with a recorder in one hand and a legal pad in the other. I told him everything. The fake signature, the reclassification, the trail flags, the bogus dues, the security footage of trespassers. He listened without blinking, then said something I'll never forget. They're trying to steal your land using paperwork, power, and patience. That's the new frontier of theft. You're not a target because you're poor. You're a target because you're isolated. He wasn't wrong. By the end of the week, Benji's story dropped online with the headline, "Hijacked by HOA, the quiet seizure of Trace family land." It spread like wildfire. Local news picked it up, then regional radio, then a national watchdog group reposted it on their site. Suddenly, I wasn't just a stubborn farmer anymore. I was the guy standing between his family's legacy and a soulless HOA land grab. With the spotlight on us, we filed an emergency injunction in district court to halt any movement on the foreclosure auction. Susan presented the forged consent form, the forensic report, the security footage, and Benji's article as supporting evidence of ongoing fraud and coercion. The judge, to his credit, didn't waste time. He granted a 60-day freeze on all actions concerning the parcel, pending full investigation. Hacienda Arroyo's lawyers responded within hours with their own motion, calling the injunction baseless, accusing me of obstruction of community development, and demanding the court enforce compliance. Their language was polished and poisoned, like the smile of a man holding a knife behind his back. But now we had something they didn't: eyes. The public was watching. Reporters started showing up at HOA board meetings. Residents were asking uncomfortable questions. People from other neighborhoods started contacting Susan with their own stories. Threats, fake notices, forged letters, slow burn land grabs masked as integration. It was bigger than my farm now. And somewhere deep in her stucco palace of passive aggression and bullet points, Karen Martinez had to know that the storm was finally coming for her. I was fixing a busted irrigation line behind the cattle shed when my phone buzzed. 3 times in a row. Rapid fire. Motion alerts. I wiped the mud off my hands and checked the security app. 3 unfamiliar vehicles parked just off the main drive. Men in button-down shirts and sunglasses stepping out, looking around like they were casing the place. One of them held a folder. Another had a camera. I stayed out of sight and watched from a distance. They didn't walk toward the barn or the house. Instead, they made a beeline to the trail markers the HOA had tried to install earlier, now mostly torn down or lying half buried in dirt. One guy snapped photos. Another took notes. I called Susan. "Inspection team," she asked. "Uninvited. Keep them on the property if you can. I'll call the county and find out who the hell sent them." I stepped out onto the path, arms crossed. "Morning," I said. The one with the camera flinched slightly. The suit with the folder stepped forward with a fake smile plastered on his face. "Mr. Trace, we're here on behalf of the County Infrastructure Partnership Program, reviewing future access corridors for planned recreational easements." I didn't answer, just stared. He continued, a little less cheerfully. "The board has authorized a survey of your eastern quadrant, standard procedure in light of the recent reclassification." I took a step closer. "There's a court-ordered freeze on all HOA-related actions concerning my land. I suggest you pack it in and drive off before the sheriff gets here." He blinked, then glanced at his colleagues. "We were unaware of any injunction. You are now." They left, but not before one of them muttered something into a phone call I was pretty sure was going straight to Karen Martinez. A few hours later, Susan confirmed what I'd already figured out. The team wasn't from the county. They were contractors hired by a private development group tied to Sierra Verde Capital, a real estate investment firm with a reputation for snatching up rural land through front-facing HOAs. Then the real bomb dropped. Benji, the journalist, showed up the next day with a USB drive and a face like someone who'd just stared into the devil's inbox. He'd been contacted by an anonymous whistleblower, an internal source from within the HOA itself. The files included recordings of private board meetings, financial records, emails, and even drafts of development proposals using my land as collateral for a future eco-lifestyle subdivision called Trace Vista. Trace, my goddamn name. One clip stood out. It was Karen's voice, clear as a bell, from a Zoom meeting labeled HOA DevConf, March 2023. "Once we finalize jurisdiction over the Trace parcel, we can secure the state grant and flip it into Phase 2. It's a waste letting that much acreage sit under a single title. He's one man. No board, no leverage. We fold him in, or we bury him under paperwork." I listened to it twice. Then I closed my eyes and clenched my fists until my palms ached. We now had concrete evidence of premeditated fraud. Karen wasn't just improvising. This was a long game play with money behind it. Susan reviewed the files, her face darkening with each page. "She used HOA funds to finance a private development bid," she muttered. "That's misappropriation. And if any of this crossed state lines, it's wire fraud." We filed a supplemental complaint in district court that same week and sent copies of the whistleblower files to the state attorney general's office. Then Susan called the Albuquerque branch of the FBI and handed it all over. We didn't know how deep this went yet, but we'd just yanked the mask off a network that had operated in the dark for years. Within days, subpoenas started flying. Karen went quiet. The HOA website went down. The community newsletter skipped a month. The sheriff assigned a deputy to patrol near my property line every night. Reporters staked out the gates of Hacienda Arroyo. The quiet, curated facade of Karen's empire was cracking, and behind it was a whole lot of rot. Then came the kicker. A public records release revealed that Gregory Madsen, the zoning officer who approved the reclassification of my farm, was Karen's cousin. It had never been disclosed. But there it was. Birth records, shared addresses growing up, even a shared family trust on a condo in Taos. That was the thread Susan had been looking for. Now it wasn't just a rogue HOA harassing a landowner. It was systemic collusion between a public official and a private entity with intent to defraud and seize land. The case was no longer civil. It was criminal, and suddenly, I wasn't just defending a farm. I was the key witness in a full-blown investigation. The knock came just before sunrise, slow and deliberate, like someone trying to sound official without waking the dead. I opened the door to find a man in a dark blue windbreaker with a badge on his chest and a file in his hand. Behind him stood two more agents, one with a camera, the other with a laptop bag. They introduced themselves as representatives of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and asked if I had a few minutes to talk. I told them I had about 60 years of history they might want to hear. We sat at the kitchen table, coffee brewing, papers stacked between us, and I laid it all out. From the first fake dues notice to the latest surveillance footage. They already had most of the whistleblower files, but what they needed was my original deed, historical tax records, and the paper trail of correspondence between me and the HOA. I handed it over piece by piece and watched as one of the agents took notes like he was mapping a battlefield. Every so often he'd pause and mutter, "Unbelievable." The next week unfolded like a controlled implosion. First came the federal subpoenas issued to Hacienda Arroyo's board members, the county zoning office, and Sierra Verde Capital. Then came the raid. Not some flashy SWAT spectacle, just a quiet, unmarked van pulling up outside the HOA's headquarters, while agents in polo shirts and khakis walked out with hard drives and cardboard boxes. Karen wasn't home when they knocked, but they left a sealed envelope taped to her door, a federal summons. The press went into overdrive. Benji released a follow-up article with a headline that stopped traffic. Feds move in. HOA president under investigation for fraud, collusion, and illegal land seizure. I started getting letters from strangers across the country, folks who'd gone through their own HOA nightmares, thanking me for standing my ground. One envelope came from a woman in Utah who'd lost her family orchard in a similar scheme. She enclosed a copy of her grandfather's title deed, folded neatly like an apology to a ghost. Meanwhile, Susan was preparing the civil case with surgical precision. She compiled every legal violation we'd uncovered: forgery, misappropriation of funds, unlawful boundary encroachment, and fraudulent foreclosure. We filed a motion to not only permanently reinstate my property rights, but to demand damages for emotional distress, property devaluation, and malicious prosecution. The number she proposed? $450,000, plus legal costs. Karen's lawyers scrambled. First, they tried to offer a settlement, half the amount, with a confidentiality clause. I told Susan to send back a picture of my middle finger. Then they pivoted to a PR campaign, releasing a desperate press statement claiming the whole thing was a misunderstanding and that the HOA's actions were based on outdated administrative maps. Problem was, the FBI had already confirmed the maps had been doctored by Karen herself using a GIS tech she paid under the table. The arrest came 2 days later. Karen was picked up in her driveway in front of 3 neighbors and a Channel 7 news van. She wore designer sunglasses and a matching hoodie that said # Boss Queen across the chest. I watched the footage later that night. She didn't speak, just climbed into the back of the cruiser and looked straight ahead like the world owed her something. But it didn't end there. A county commissioner and 2 members of the zoning office resigned within 48 hours of the arrest. One of them, Madsen's assistant, confessed to shredding internal memos that warned against the reclassification. Turned state's evidence, spilled everything. The prosecutors now had enough to file multiple felony charges: conspiracy to commit fraud, falsification of public records, abuse of authority, and attempted illegal acquisition of private property. I should have felt vindicated, but mostly I just felt tired. The land was quiet again. No trucks, no surveyors, just wind in the grass and the sound of cattle kicking dust into the morning sun. But under the surface, everything had changed. The system that was supposed to protect people like me had tried to sell me out. And now, finally, that same system was beginning to eat its own. The courtroom was packed. Local reporters, HOA members with forced expressions of neutrality, and a few people from the community who probably just wanted to see Karen in handcuffs. I sat in the second row behind Susan, who looked like she was about to cross-examine God himself. Karen's defense team showed up with stacks of folders and the smugness of people who thought charm could outmaneuver evidence. They were wrong. The judge opened the hearing with a statement that made it clear he wasn't interested in theatrics. The court is reviewing whether the defendants knowingly participated in the unlawful reclassification, acquisition, and attempted resale of private property without legal authority or consent. He then proceeded to read through the charges, which sounded like the legal equivalent of being hit by a truck full of bricks. First came the fraud, the forged consent document with my fake signature, which the handwriting expert tore apart line by line. Then came the zoning collusion, emails between Karen and Gregory Madsen, where they openly discussed fast-tracking the integration of the trace land and joked about how old farmers don't read digital notices. That one got an audible reaction from the gallery. Susan walked the court through the financial audit, showing how HOA funds had been siphoned to cover community development expenses that were, in fact, payments to Sierra Verde Capital Consultants. Then came the whistleblower files played aloud for the jury, Karen's voice calm and confident, talking about folding him in or burying him under paperwork. They tried to object. The judge waved it off. You'll have your turn. When it came time for my testimony, I kept it simple. I talked about the farm, how my grandfather built it with his hands and a borrowed tractor, how I'd lived through droughts, hurricanes, a busted spine, and 3 years in the Navy, but nothing prepared me for the feeling of someone trying to steal my land, using legalese and bold font. I showed them the original deed, yellowed and cracked, but still mine. I told them about the night I stood with a shotgun watching strangers drive posts into my soil like it didn't matter. I looked Karen dead in the eyes and said, this was never about dues or boundaries. This was about greed, pretending to be order. The jury didn't even blink. After 2 days of testimony and cross-examination, the verdict came swift. The judge declared me the sole uncontested owner of the Trace Farm. He awarded full restitution of title, permanent immunity from any future HOA jurisdiction, and, best of all, compensatory damages of $450,000 for emotional distress, unlawful encroachment, and reputational harm. The courtroom buzzed like a kicked beehive. Karen was found guilty on multiple counts, Madsen too. The prosecutor announced that further indictments were pending for Sierra Verde executives. The HOA board was dissolved by emergency order. Every fake map, every forged file, every inch of falsified zoning was scrubbed from the county records like a bad tattoo. But the moment that stuck with me happened after the hearing. A young man, early 20s, nervous hands, approached me outside the courthouse, said his grandfather had lost his land back in the 80s to a similar scheme, never got it back, died bitter and broke. The kid thanked me, said watching this unfold gave his family peace. That was the first time I let myself feel the weight of it all, not just what I fought for, but what I'd stopped from happening again. We drove back home in silence. The sky over Sandoval County was pale and wide. Susan said the governor's office had reached out. There was talk of drafting a new bill, one that would require notarized, recorded consent for any HOA annexation attempt. They wanted to name it after me. I told her to let them. A month after the trial, a new sign stood at the eastern edge of my land, where the road curved just shy of the old cottonwoods. I carved the letters myself, slow and deliberate, just the way my grandfather had taught me to do when I was a boy, learning the value of permanence. It read, "This land belongs to the Trace family, and always will. No glossy HOA logo. No numbered tract, just wood, iron bolts, and truth." The media circus moved on fast. Some other scandal, another governor's race, a celebrity DUI, but the impact didn't disappear. The state legislature passed the Trace Act within weeks. It stated in no uncertain terms that no private or governmental entity shall incorporate private land into a communal jurisdiction, including any homeowners association, without notarized registered consent of the deed holder. They even invited me to stand next to the governor for the signing. I wore my best flannel and said as little as I could. Karen Martinez was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, with no option for parole in the first 6. Gregory Madsen got 7 years and a lifetime ban from holding public office or zoning authority. Sierra Verde Capital was hit with a $3 million class action settlement brought on by a group of rural homeowners across the Southwest, people who'd realized their land had been targeted in similar ways. My testimony was cited in several of those cases. The HOA, formerly known as Hacienda Arroyo Estates, was dissolved, its assets liquidated, its board scattered, and its newsletter reduced to a dead link and a ghost domain. The development that was supposed to replace my farm never got past a PowerPoint presentation. Instead, they planted native grasses where their planning office once stood. Irony, I suppose. But I didn't become a martyr. I didn't want to be. I was a farmer before all this, and I was damn sure going to be one after. With the compensation money, I restored the south fence, repaved the old gravel road, and bought a used but sturdy windmill to power the livestock well. I set up a scholarship fund under my grandfather's name for local kids going into agricultural studies. I didn't tell anyone about it, just let it sit there quietly doing good. Then I did one last thing. I founded the Trace Legal Defense Fund, a nonprofit offering legal aid to rural property owners facing unlawful pressure from HOAs, developers, or zoning boards. Susan joined as its first director. Benji's article about it ran under the title, "When One Farmer Said No." I told him the story wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to everyone who ever had to fight for the ground beneath their feet. Most days now are just that, days. I wake up before the sun, sip coffee on the porch, listen to the coyotes fading off in the hills. The fence holds, the cattle roam, and the sky is still as wide as it was the day I was born. I don't think justice means returning things to how they were. I think it means making sure no one else gets buried while shouting the truth. I didn't start this fight, but I damn sure finished it. And this land, it remembers.